what are the early foundations, and what is scaffolding early in development. You can imagine if you're building a new structure, it's really important that the foundations are solid, because that will form the basis upon which the structure is built. So we can think about knowledge as well as having a foundation that influences how children learn and how well they can progress along their learning trajectories. And when we talk about foundational competencies, it perhaps helps to draw an analogy here to what is referred to as phonological awareness. Many of you will know what phonological awareness is, but for those of you who don't, it's essentially a person's awareness that language decomposes into units of sound. So for example, being able to label the phonemes in bat and rat and and being able to sort of blend those phonemes together as well. And phonological awareness develops even before children learn to read, before they can decode print, before they can associate letters with speech sounds. And there's research showing that individual differences in phonological awareness in pre-readers predicts their later reading skills. So in my lab and in many groups around the world, we're trying to identify, if you like, the phonological awareness equivalent or phonological awareness equivalence in the domain of numeracy. We're trying to understand whether there are similar core foundations that we can identify very early in development, and that will help us to set children on the right trajectory of growth in numeracy. So what do we know about the foundational competencies underlying math? What do we know about some of the key building blocks of math? One of the things I want to focus on today, which is the subject of a lot of my research, is to look at how children understand numerical symbols, such as Arabic numerals and also number words. Numerical symbols are really interesting because we're not born with an ability to process numerical symbols. They are a relatively recent human cultural invention. And as the slide or the picture on the left-hand side of the slide suggests, these symbols have evolved quite considerably over the last 6,000 years or so. And now we teach children how to represent and process Arabic numerals. And Arabic numerals have almost become a universal language of mathematics, if you like, across the globe. We can now trade with people who speak different languages using these symbolic representations. So they're incredibly powerful, but they're also incredibly abstract. And each and every child needs to learn them over the course of early human development. Knowing about numerical symbols is not something that comes naturally to children, just like reading doesn't come naturally to children either. And there is indeed a growing body of research that shows that children's early understanding of numerical symbols, such as Arabic numerals and number words, is a critical scaffold and therefore represents a foundational skill. And if we think about learning about numerical symbols, if we try to put ourselves in the mind of a 3, 4, 5-year-old, we can appreciate the complexity that comes with learning what this symbol 5 refers to, because it does have many different references. For us as adults, we process numerical symbols such as 5 in our everyday lives when we check our favorite news site in the morning, but children need a lot of time to acquire this level of automaticity and fluency in processing numerical symbols. So let's just go through some of the things that children have to learn about the symbol 5. Well, first of all, they have to learn that it refers to all sets of a quantity of 5. And that is what we call cardinality. And that's really about symbol quantity relationships, knowing that this symbol 5 can represent 5 apples, 5 sounds, 5 cars, 5 clouds, an infinite list of sets of 5. But children don't just need to learn the relationship between sets and symbols, they also need to learn that symbols are part of a sequence and therefore carry positional and rank information. That, for example, 5 comes before 6, but after 4. And that's an incredibly powerful inference that children can make. Now they can process symbol-symbol relationships without necessarily referring directly to the cardinality. Then children also need to learn, just like for letters, that 5 is part of a visual category and therefore carries invariance. What do I mean by invariance? I mean that a 5 can be printed in different font sizes and different font types, but still represent the same symbol, still represent the same cardinality, still represent the same positional information. And children also have to learn how to transcode between different symbolic representations. What do I mean by transcoding? For example, children have to learn that this symbol 5 refers to the number word 5, either in spoken language 5 or in written language. So there are multiple ways of representing this symbol 5, and children need to be able to flexibly transcode between these different representations. And of course, it doesn't stop at single digit numerals, but as soon as we go to multi-digit numerals, we have to learn about place value, and we have to learn that 5 is not the same magnitude irrespective of its position in a multi-digit number sequence, but that instead its position in a multi-digit number sequence determines its value. And that's where a lot of young children can struggle to learn these rules about place value, the hundreds place, the ones place, and so forth. So children vary greatly in what they know when they enter kindergarten. And this is, I think, is incredibly important and something that we should be paying more attention to, and being able to assess children early on for what they know when they come into kindergarten, because it is there that they start to build their informal and formal mathematical abilities. So it's therefore important to assess what children know to inform individualized instruction. Some children come into kindergarten knowing all sorts of things about numbers, knowing about cardinality, knowing about ordinality, but others perhaps don't. And those children need more time, need more instruction. Teachers eventually will find out which children lack those foundational competencies. But if they had evidence-based measures to further their instruction, that might help them to catch those children early on. One of the real critical distinctions early in the development of symbolic numerical skills is about counting, and is knowing that there is a difference between knowing how to count, how to recite the count sequence, versus knowing what counting means. For those of you who have interacted with young children, you will know that many 2-year-olds are quite fluent at reciting the count sequence from 1 to 10. But if you ask them, for example, to give you 5 objects, they're unable to do so. And that is because at that point in their development, the count sequence is a meaningless sequence that they can recite, but they don't actually know what the purpose of counting is. That the purpose of counting is to enumerate sets, is to determine, in other words, the cardinality of a set, and to determine the cardinal value. If I've got 5 apples in front of me, I can count them 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then I know that the last word in the count sequence denotes the total number of items in that set. So that's a very powerful knowledge to develop. But often that develops after children are already quite fluent at reciting the count sequence. So just because a child can recite the count sequence, it doesn't necessarily mean that they know what the purpose of counting is, which is to determine the cardinality of a set. So cardinality is incredibly important. So how do we go about assessing cardinality? For that, I just want to show you a brief video, and if you can't hear the audio, then don't worry about that. I'll narrate over it. So this is actually in my living room, and this is my former graduate student, Mariah Sokolowski, who's now a postdoctoral fellow at the Rodman Institute in Toronto. And what Mariah's doing here is assessing my son's, Leo's, understanding of cardinality. Just going to pause briefly here and just elaborate a little bit. So what Mariah is doing is she's showing Leo this puppet dinosaur. It's called Dino. And she's telling Leo that Dino really likes to eat a lot of square blocks. And then she says, can you give Dino 2 blocks? And Leo's able to produce, at that time, he was able to produce the number 2 and the number 1. But as soon as Mariah asked him to give blocks of a larger number, let's say 3 or 4 blocks, Leo would just persist in giving 2 blocks or giving all the blocks. So this task is what we refer to as the give a number task. And it's an incredibly sensitive and powerful way for assessing whether children know what the purpose of counting is. Because if they understand what the purpose of counting is, then if somebody asks them for a certain cardinal numbers, let's say 3 blocks, they're able to use counting to produce those 3 blocks. And it turns out, and we've known this for quite some time, that this process takes a long time, that children go through so-called knower levels. So early in development, children become one knowers, then they gradually become two knowers, so they're able to produce one and two, but not anything higher than two. Then they become three knowers and four knowers, and eventually they become what we refer to as cardinality principal knowers. That is, they can give all numbers in their count sequence. So let's say they can count up to 10. That would also mean that they can produce 10 objects if asked for them. But this process, we have to know, takes quite a lot of time. And in our research and the research of others, we've seen a lot of variability in when children move from becoming subset knowers, as we call them, being able to give 1, 2, 3, and 4 objects, to being able to give all objects that are in their count sequence, all cardinalities that are in their count sequence. We see a huge amount of variability. So we've seen 5-year-olds who are not yet cardinality principal knowers, and we have seen 3-year-olds who are cardinality principal knowers. So there are huge individual differences. And I think for those of you who are parents listening in to this, it's really important for you to know that there is no set point, there's no age at which children absolutely will be cardinality principal knowers, but that there's a huge variability in when children become cardinality principal knowers. We don't know the reasons for, the precise reasons for those individual differences between children, between when they become cardinality principal knowers, but what we know is that there is this variability and it does exist. We also know that becoming cardinality principal knower does not emerge spontaneously. We know that there are effects of how much parents talk about numbers in their home, how much they engage in numerical activity that influence when children become cardinality principal knowers. So this is an incredibly important milestone in children's development when they move from being able to recite the count sequence to being able to use counting to enumerate sets. And that can be very nicely assessed by the given number task. And if you're interested in administering this task, drop me an email and I will send you the instruction, and you can use pretty much any materials you've got around the house to look at what your child's knower level is, if you're interested in that. The next question I want to address, which is getting a little bit more practical, is how do we foster children's development of early numerical skills? And what do we know from research and experience about how children's early numerical skills can be fostered? I imagine that for many of you, this is a question that is a forefront of your minds right now as you're at home with your child. It's certainly a question that I'm asking myself with a 6-year-old. So here are a few evidence-informed suggestions of how you might be able to foster your child's numerical development. The first one is there is a lot of good research to show that playing linear board games such as snakes and ladders, chutes and ladders, rockets and comets, there's different versions of this game. It can be very beneficial. Research at Carnegie Mellon University by Robert Siegler has repeatedly shown that children really benefit from these activities, from moving along these number paths, from matching the dice face to the Arabic numerals. And of course, these games can also be used as a springboard for conversations about number. How many more places on the board do you have to move ahead? What's the difference between where you were and where you are now after you've gone down a ladder or up a ladder, or down a snake, or down a chute, or down a comet. So there's lots of conversations that can be had. So lots of numerical conversations using number words, talking about numerical relations whilst engaging in these playful activities can be extremely powerful. Then I also want to show you some activities that I've picked up over the years from teachers sharing activities on social media, for example, that I think are very powerful, and activities that we can all do in our homes with young children. This one is an activity that you could probably, if you have a printer at home and a computer, you can probably recreate this activity. And this is an incredibly powerful activity for helping children to understand the relationship between symbols, in this case Arabic numerals, and sets. And this activity also allows you to communicate to children about the spatial invariance of sets. That is, each one of those cards represents the same number, but the dots in this case are differently arranged in different spatial configuration. And that teaches children about the invariance of sets, the quantitative invariance of sets, that each of those exemplars refers to the same number, despite the fact that they're differently arranged in the spatial sense. There's other activities such as the learning carpets, which of course we don't necessarily have in our home, but we can nevertheless create similar types of activities where now you can talk about a lot of different things here. You can talk about the relationship between symbols, Arabic numerals, and sets, multiple different representations of sets. You can also talk about the invariance as a function of font size. You can see the second and third row, they're printed in different font sizes. So lots of conversations can be had, and this can be scaled in so many different ways using all kinds of different materials, and can be even extended to talk about spatial relationships using geometrical patterns and so forth. So there's a lot of powerful things that can be done here to help children understand basic fundamental concepts around number, such as cardinality and ordinality and so forth. Just to show you that this can be done at home, a while ago I was preparing a presentation using some aspects of this slide deck, and my son leaned over and looked at my computer and he said, "I want to do this, Papa." So we just took some materials we had around in the home and sort of recreated this, this activity, and then had conversations around cardinality and ordinality as well. So there's lots of things you can do. And one of the pieces of materials that we used for this is a beautiful educational resource that I would highly recommend to people, and it is something that you can order online. And I promise I have no financial interest in this. This is something developed by Dan Finkel, who's a particularly innovative developer of curriculum materials. It's called Tiny Polka Dots. And Tiny Polka Dots has these different ways of representing cardinalities, as you can see, including 10 frames, but also random spatial patterns, canonical spatial patterns, Arabic numerals, connected array of dots. And what's really powerful about Tiny Polka Dots is that it also comes with lots of suggested activities for different ages. So it's developmentally sensitive. So you can use this not just with very young children, but also with kids in early primary grades to talk about addition and subtraction, talk about cardinality, ordinality. There's lots of different activities here. So it's certainly something that I've been using quite a bit in these days to do some numerically related activities. So the second point I want to turn to is, does gender play a role? This is something that I get asked almost every time I give a talk about numerical processing in children to broader audiences. And it is, of course, a very important question, because a lot of people believe that there are differences between boys and girls. And it's a commonly held assumption that boys are better at math than girls. But we really need to ask, what do the data tell us? What do we know from research about gender differences? So what do we know? Is there gender similarities? Are there gender differences? Well, I want to introduce you to a few findings that point very much to an absence of gender differences in the data that we have. So this is a very powerful article here by Janet Hyde that was published in Science magazine some years ago. And what Janet Hyde and her colleagues did was to look at standardized test data from the United States, from literally millions of students. And what they found was that there's overwhelming evidence for gender similarities and very little evidence for gender differences. So this is a complex slide, but if you just focus on the second column there, that is what is called an effect size. So that is how large are the gender differences. And what you can see is those effect sizes are tiny, and they go, interestingly, also in both directions. And that turns out to be the case all the way from grade 2 through to grade 11. And in the last column, you can see the number of children who were included in this analysis. So this is really a large-scale analysis of the effect of gender on math performance, in this case standardized testing, there's no data here to suggest that there are meaningful gender differences. This is also reflected in the Program for International Student Assessment. So if we move beyond the United States to take a more global perspective, again, a very busy slide, but the take-home message here is that when the bars go down and they are dark blue, that means there's a significant difference in favor of boys in the country. When they go up, it's a significant difference in favor of girls. So what you can see here is, first of all the differences are relatively small in magnitude in terms of the size of the effect, and they go in both directions. And in many cases in the light blues, those differences are actually not statistically significant. Now, this suggests that there is, again, evidence globally for more gender similarities. And if there are gender differences, they go in both directions. Contrast that with the PISA gender differences for reading literacy. This is overwhelming evidence in favor of girls outperforming boys. Yet we have less of a, I think, societal debate around gender differences in reading. And of course, they're much larger than the gender differences in math. So the next time somebody talks to you about gender differences in math, or you hear somebody saying, well, you know, my son is better at math, and I've heard that boys are intrinsically more inclined to be better at math, I think you need to refer them to these data. And there's many more data. I don't want to bore you with all of the details, but there's many more data to suggest a very similar pattern at different points in development. So overwhelming evidence for gender differences, for gender similarities, but not for gender differences. And I think this is really important because sometimes our societal the way we talk about math, the way we talk about gender and math can have a negative impact on girls who start to internalize this false stereotype and therefore might start to avoid mathematical subjects and eventually STEM-related careers. And of course, we know that we need more people, and especially more women, in these STEM-related careers. So the final thing I want to talk about is mathematics anxiety. Mathematics anxiety is real. I've heard some people say it's not a thing, but we know from a lot of research that mathematics anxiety exists, and it can have devastating consequences for students who are affected by it. So for example, here's a quote from a student who says, "Math exams terrify me, my palms get sweaty, I breathe too fast, and often I can't even make my eyes focus on the paper. It's worse if I look around because I'd see everybody else working and I know that I'm the only one who can't do it." So quite a sort of devastating report from a young student affected by mathematics anxiety. So what do we know about mathematics anxiety? Well, turning again to the Program for International Student Assessment, which Canada is a participating country in, run by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. They ask students of several questions around mathematics anxiety. And as you can see here, 60% of students, these are students in 8th grade, so around the age of 15, many of them, 60% of them say, "I often worry that it will be difficult for me in math classes." Around 30%, 35% say, "I get very tense when I have to do mathematics homework," and so forth. So students in 8th grade, and there's similar data from younger children as well, report quite high levels of emotional reactions towards math. So mathematics anxiety is very common. So what do we take away from that? Well, and I think this applies also in these days when we work with students in our homes, is that we need to take students' attitudes and emotions into account when we teach them, whether that is professional teachers engaging in teaching or amateurs such as myself trying to do some form of homeschool. Because we know that mathematics anxiety affects performance dramatically, and the fear for math is prevalent. And also very critically, we know that mathematics anxiety is not just an emotional problem, but it has cognitive corollaries or cognitive consequences. There's a lot of research to suggest that when students experience mathematics anxiety, it occupies part of their, what we refer to as working memory, their ability to hold a limited set of items in mind whilst completing a mathematical task. So their worries basically take away part of their processing power. So now you have even less power to do even less cognitive resources, if you like, to do the math task, because you're also processing your anxiety, you're also processing your worries. So I think we need to be aware of that. The other thing that we need to be aware of is that when a student experiences mathematics anxiety, that doesn't necessarily mean that they have a mathematics problem, that they have, for example, developmental dyscalculia, or that they will never be able to learn math. And I think that's actually a very powerful message and a very important message that's emerged from more recent research, specifically a paper by Amy Devine and colleagues that was published in 2018 in the Journal of Educational Psychology. They took a large group of students from the UK, and they basically plotted what you can see on the y-axis is mathematics performance, and on the x-axis you can see mathematics anxiety. And as you can see here, there isn't a strong relationship. And really critically are the filled dots here, so the black dots. Those are students who have been diagnosed with developmental dyscalculia or a math learning difficulty. And you can see that they span the entire spectrum of mathematics anxiety, which means that there are some students who have a real math learning difficulty who don't experience math anxiety. And on the other hand, there are students who have a math learning problem who do experience high levels of math anxiety. And that goes for all students, not just dyscalculics. So it's really important for us to not take mathematics anxiety as a sign that the student will not be able to learn math. And that's very positive, because I think we can deal with the math anxiety and free up the student's mind to engage in the math and to actually find it something that they enjoy and that they derive satisfaction from. So math anxiety does not necessarily mean that students are going to be dyscalculic, that they have a math difficulty. It's in a way the emotional and the cognitive components here are connected, but they're also separate from one another. Research is also showing us that what we do as adults matters for students' math anxiety. We know from research at the University of Chicago, led by Sian Beilock and colleagues, that teachers' math anxiety can affect students' math achievement. This was a longitudinal study in which students were tested in first grade for their mathematics anxiety and their math abilities, and the teachers were also tested for their math anxiety. And it turned out that at the beginning of the first grade, students and teachers' math anxiety was not related, but by the end of grade 1, it was related. So almost as if the teachers' math anxiety had rubbed off onto the students. And importantly, in the context of gender, this was really mediated by how much students sort of held this gender stereotype that girls are intrinsically less able to do math than boys, which I just showed you is not supported by the data. So there's a lot of things we need to be aware of as teachers when we engage with students, of how much we sort of pass on our math anxiety, and perhaps also our implicit stereotypes around gender and math. The same applies, and this is very important in the current times, to parents. Work by Erin Maloney, who's a professor at the University of Ottawa, has shown that parents' math anxiety also affects students' achievement, and particularly, and I think this is relevant to the world we live in at the present moment, she found that those parents who had high math anxiety, if they did a lot of homework with their children, their children's math scores actually declined over the school years. So if you have high math anxiety, and right now you are sort of feel a responsibility to engage in mathematical learning activities with your child, try to think about your math anxiety, try to think about how your math anxiety might affect your child, and don't make those encounters with math too stressful, as that might have unintended consequences, as we can see from research. The positive thing here is that children who had low math anxiety, it didn't matter how much homework they did with their child in terms of the degree of projected math growth across the school year. So there are some positive take homes here as well. And if we become aware of our math anxiety, if we think about our math anxiety, if we reflect on it, then perhaps we can also engage with our children in ways that don't create a situation where our math anxiety affects their performance. So I know I'm running out of time. I just wanted to close by saying that this is just a tiny taste of what we know about math learning. Math learning is a very, very complex thing, and there's lots of different components, and I just want to highlight a few of them. So obviously, a factor that I haven't had time to talk about is spatial cognition. We know that our awareness of space, our awareness of spatial relations, our ability to spatially visualize numerical relations is incredibly important. There's lots of research on that, and great research happening here in the province of Ontario as well around that. We know that working memory is really important. I briefly referred to working memory when I talked about math anxiety, this limited capacity that we have to store and manipulate information as we, for example, solving multi-digit problems. We need to borrow and carry. That involves working memory. We know that that's incredibly important for math in general, and we know that individual differences in children's working memory skills are related to their math ability. We know that emotional factors are important. I did talk about math anxiety. We also know that there's a connection between reading and math, and many research groups, including ours, are trying to find out what precisely is that connection. We know that phonological awareness that I talked about in the very beginning of my talk is important. We know that executive functionings, our ability to inhibit certain responses, our ability to organize our thinking is incredibly important for math as well. And language really counts. And I think it's very important to use a lot of mathematical language around your house if you can, as that draws children's attention to it. And we also know that there are differences between languages in how numbers are represented. And that's something to be aware of, especially in the Canadian context where we have lots of children growing up in multilingual homes, including myself. I speak German to my son. So there are differences in the way that numbers are represented in German and English that I have to be aware of when I teach him in both languages. Basic number processing is really important. I talked about cardinality, ordinality, learning about symbols, learning the difference between the reciting the count sequence and being able to know what the count sequence gives you. Teachers are incredibly important, and we all, I think, can agree that teachers play a critical role in children's math learning. Sadly, right now, we have limited access to them, but hopefully the day will return where all children will be in classes and get benefit in terms of their math development. The final thing I want to say, and I think this is really important, is that we need to look at all of this developmentally, that different factors play different roles at different points in development. And math is multi-componential, but math is also incredibly developmental. And at different points in development, different math skills become important and different factors influence our math learning. So with that, I'd like to thank you very much for your attention. I've got my website on this slide, as well as my email address. So please feel free to reach out if you have any questions. And I hand it over to the moderator now, and I believe there's time for Q&A.
Yeah, thank you so much. This has been fantastic. We do have a couple of questions, and if there are more, please feel free to type them in. The first question I want to ask is around rote memorization. So there might be a lot of parents and educators that remember a time, and maybe even still we are a little bit in a time when there is a value placed on rote memorization for students in terms of math. In your research and experience, does rote memorization play a role in developing a foundation of mathematical skills with good results?
I do believe so. I mean, this is kind of a hot debate in the math education literature, and has been for a long time. Sort of this this idea that, you know, either you teach rote memorization or you teach understanding. I think most math educators nowadays understand that both go hand in hand, that you need both, but that, of course, rote memorization, or I like to call it mathematical fluency, being able to recall your math facts, is incredibly important. It can free up working memory resources if you're working on more complex problems. But I think rote memorization alone is not sufficient. Students need to understand relationships between number facts as well. That's incredibly important, that they're not just isolated pieces of information in their memory. But of course, working on fluency can be extremely important and adaptive, but it shouldn't come at the cost of understanding. I think both of those things are incredibly important. But knowing your math facts, I think, is something that will continue to be important even in the future. Yeah.
That's great. Thank you for that. Another question is, can you give examples of what math language might look like for anyone who is interested in incorporating that into their family conversations or outside of math class? What would that look like?
I think I'm going to talk primarily for parents with young children, you know, preschool and early elementary schools. It's doing things around counting, around enumerating sets, asking children, so how many trees do you see outside? How many knives and forks do we need to lay out? You know, can you tell me, are those, do we have the same number of apples and the same number of oranges, sort of talking about the relationship between sets, just drawing children's attention to the fact that math is all around them all of the time. Talking about shapes, labeling shapes, those kinds of conversations I think can be incredibly powerful. It's not something that I at least do without being consciously aware of it when I spend time with my son, but if I force myself to do that, I can find examples everywhere we look. We can talk about number, because math is in fact all around us, and talking about size differences, for example, with very young children, you know, is this larger than that, comparative judgments, things like that. So I think there are many very easy ways of actually doing that.
That's fantastic. Okay, I have a little bit more of a technical question for you.
Mm-hmm.
So given how sequential math learning is in schools, do you feel that attendance is a limiting factor in students' ability to do math? So can teachers and parents, what might they be able to do for students that are missing a significant amount of time so that they can continue to progress?
Yeah, that's not an area of my expertise on how absentee rates affect student learning. I guess it's a very current question, since so many children, we are all experiencing, all of our children and the children of our friends and families are experiencing this time of not being in school. I don't have any concrete advice on how to fill that void, and it will be a real challenge for educational systems to come back to that. But it's not, I haven't worked on the effect of absentee rates on children's math development.
Do you have any suggestions on things that are go-to activities or go-to conversations around math that they might be able to have when you don't have a math background that might support the continued development of these basic foundational skills?
Yeah, so the tiny polka dots that I showed, if you've got children between the ages of 4 and 7 or 8, I would look into the polka dots. If that's something that you can't afford, you can probably make a deck yourself if you just look at the materials online. That could be a fun activity to do as well. I'm currently really enjoying using Empower. That's a TV Ontario initiative that is a great online platform with really fantastic games for all sorts of ages. So that can be incredibly informative. There are some resources. So for example, the London chapter of the Ontario Association for Learning Disabilities, I don't know if I'm saying that correctly right now, recently tweeted out a link with lots of resources. I think there's tons of resources online. If you go to the website of an organization called understood.org, you will find activities there. I think if you are looking for activities right now, there's lots of people sharing really great activities, including many teachers. So I think the internet right now is a great resource. Of course, I don't think realistically there's any way in this time that we can really fill the gap that is left by having our kids at home, unless you are a math teacher, and I envy you, but you will also not have the same amount of time because you've got other things going on in your life. So I think we've all got to be compassionate with ourselves and with our children during this time, because there is no true way of filling that gap. But there are some simple activities. If they don't induce stress, if they don't induce math anxiety, I say go for it.
That's fantastic. Thank you. We had one teacher write in that math before bed was something that she recommended, and it's capital. Yes. It must be an activity.
Yes, thank you. That's excellent. The bedtime math. Yeah, that's. I've heard a lot of good things about it. I haven't tried it yet, but there's been some research showing that it can have positive effects too.
Yeah, absolutely. Another really good question that piques some curiosity for me as well is how important is it to learn your multiplication tables if a child is really resistant to it? In your experience, do you find that to be an issue of laziness, anxiety, or ability? How might a parent be able to distinguish between the main sources of apprehension in children learning multiplication tables?
It's incredibly difficult to do that, I think, as a parent. I think having open conversations with your child about what they find difficult about it, you might not always get an answer. I certainly have experienced that I don't get an answer around these kinds of questions with young children. I would say take it easy, find fun and engaging ways to do it. There is a really great, and I forget the name now, it's something like Multiplication Rock Stars, that is basically, if you're really keen on having your child learn your multiplication tables, you might want to look at that, because it's a computer-based thing, but you basically compete with others, and the competition is around how fast you can solve your multiplication facts, but it's done in a non-stressful way. And it's developed in Britain, and they've seen some tremendous results with this. I mean, kids can get so fast at solving their multiplication tables. I doubt, unless a child really has a specific math learning difficulty, I don't think there are any children who can't learn their multiplication facts, but maybe it's about thinking about multiple different formats. So not just using the worksheets, but also using other technology-based applications right now to enhance their fluency with the multiplication facts.
It's really interesting how you mentioned what the research says about a parent's anxiety about math and the implications that it has on their own child too. So I'm wondering if a parent who had a lot of math anxiety might be inclined to be helping their child and really push the importance of math so that they don't have the same experience that they did. But in the same way, they might also be participating and increasing the anxiety just based on their goodwill.
Yeah, I think that is problematic. I think we can all reflect on, right now we're being, as parents at least, we're being forced to reflect on our own emotional relationships to all sorts of school subjects. One thing that has been shown to be efficacious in some research is simply writing, and maybe this is what high math anxious parents need to do, is writing about your anxiety, because that allows you to sort of get it out of your mind, put it down on paper, and then be sort of free from it. And that can perhaps make you less anxious and more ready to interact with your child. And also, you know, look at what's expected in the Ontario. If you're based in Ontario, if you're based in a different province or outside of Canada, try to study the curriculum materials. They are online, they're available, the expectations. So that can sometimes reduce your anxiety, because often as parents, we don't necessarily know what our children are expected to learn in the classroom, because that's what school does, you know. But now we kind of maybe have to look at that, and that can also lessen our anxiety, because we can see, well, actually, I know how to do that, and I can think about ways of teaching that, or I can find the right materials of doing that. I think sometimes we have an image in our mind of math that is not really consistent with what the expectations are, and we can discover that we're actually not as bad at math as we think. And remember as well that being anxious of math doesn't mean you can't do the math. That's what the research quite clearly shows.
Yeah, that sounds great. Thank you. We had one person write in mentioning that a deck of cards can go a long way.
Yes.
And that they've adapted a traditional war game to become multiplication war. So there is a suggestion from somebody who was thinking about multiplication tables. Another question I have here is around a preference between like a math workbook and interactive activities for children ages 5 to 7. Do you have a preference there?
I think you can probably do both. I mean, worksheets have become a bit of a no-no in many circles of education, but I think at this time there's no harm in doing some worksheets. I've certainly been sent some from my son's school, so I think you need to have a balance between both. I mean, realistically in this situation, it's also a case whereby sometimes it helps just to put a worksheet down and say, solve the next 2 or 3 answers and I'll come back to you. And in the meantime, you can put a load of laundry on or whatever is currently needed. So I think a balance between the two, and find things that both, yeah, I mean, that your child enjoys at least in part, and that it can be related to what they have traditionally been doing in their classrooms. I think that's very important as well, giving them some sense of normality around this very abnormal situation, is to do activities that they would have traditionally also done in their classrooms.
That's awesome. Thank you so much for your time today. Really appreciate having you on. There have been a lot of requests for, can we please have more of this, which is always a good signal that people are really interested. Thank you again for all you've had to offer. Just as a reminder, this session was recorded. As soon as we have the opportunity to get it up on our website, you'll be emailed the link. And please feel free to pass that around to anyone who's interested. Daniel, thanks again for your time, and everyone stay well, stay healthy, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Yes, indeed. Have a good day. Thanks very much.
Thank you.